Greetings and welcome. In this video I want to talk extensively on my thoughts about Frank Herbert Dune, the first book of 6, the starter of one of the craziest and most influential sci-fi stories of all time, and that changed our culture forever. So if you like Dune, consider leaving a like and subscribing. Let's just get on with this. The edition of the Dune books that I will be reading is the Brazilian ones. I found the covers absolutely beautiful. The artworks were made by Mark Simonetti, and I find his depictions of Dune incredible. Another thing is that I bought both the trilogy box editions. I will be showing some images of them for you. And this first trilogy beside the books comes with a map of Arrakis, which I find extremely interesting to look at. Another thing is that I should point out that this analysis will be fully in chronological order, but I will be hinting at things outside the books and also mention others that happen way later. So yes, spoiler warning. If you wanna read the books or watch the movies before getting spoiled, I would suggest you do that before watching this video. Or if you don't care about spoilers at all, I don't know, just watch this video. Let's open the book up and read it. That's what matters. The contents within these pages. The book starts with an introduction by Neil Gaiman, basically telling us about the importance and influence of this book, and after this we get into the actual story. Something very important to take note in Dune is how every chapter starts with a quote, a piece of text written by a future or contemporary historian, describing something of importance related to the events of said chapter. In the case of this first book, every quote is by Irulan, describing the life of someone called Muad'Dib. I wonder if we'll get to meet that guy. From the beginning, this book introduces you to a lot of unique terms and concepts. Thankfully, towards the end of the book, there are some notes on the meaning of such terms and words, which can help you along with this distant future. Talking about distant future, the story of Dune also happens around 20,000 years into the future, which is now measured by the beginning of the Guild, that being before Guild and after Guild, so time measurement works like that in this universe. Finally, Dune is separated into 3 smaller parts called books, and the first one is, well, titled Dune. The first few chapters introduces us to the core characters: Paul Atreides, the main character, Jessica, his mother, Gaius Helen Mohiam, the Reverend Mother, a high-ranking official of the Bene Gesserit, a group that work under shadows with the goal of controlling the noble family's reproduction and the politics of the Imperium, of which is comprised with the Emperor Shaddam IV on one side and the Landsraad, the union of all the higher and lower houses, on the other. So, going back to the story itself, at the very first chapter, Gaius tests Paul in something called the Gonjabar, to identify if he can control his impulses or not. If Paul fails this test, Gaius will simply use a poisonous needle to kill him, this poisonous needle being the Gonjabar. But to Mohiam's surprise, Paul passes the test, withstanding more pain than anyone else who has ever passed the Gonjabar. He is indeed a human, not an animal. Going back to the introductions a little bit, other important groups and characters in the story are the Chom, a company that works as the center of all universal trade, and that currently has 59% of its stocks owned by the Corino family of the Emperor. Some other characters are Gurney Halleck and Duncan Idaho, 2 very important Atreides fighters. Duncan most of all, we will get to talk about him a lot in the future. There's also Dr. Yui, a special doctor from the School of Suk. These doctors are conditioned to be fully loyal to their hiring nobles. Not only that, but also to help preserve any life that's currently under danger. For that reason, they simply cannot kill anyone. There's also Tufer Hawat, a Mentat who works as a human computer. And talking about computers, do you know about the Butlerian Jihad? Basically, the Butlerian Jihad was a civil war between humanity and those that held powers over machines, of which were sentient and had minds superior to those of humans. After this war, more than 10,000 years ago, artificial intelligence was banned from ever being created by humans again. That law still reigns strong today, except in a planet called Ix. We'll get to talk about Ix and the Tleilaxu, but they're not important in this first book, so let's just put them aside for now. The villains of the story are Baron Vladimir Harkonnen and his siblings Feyd Rautha Harkonnen and Brute Raban. There's also their evil mentat, Peter de Vries. Moreover, the last important character that we have to know right now is Leto Atreides, Paul's father, who is currently the head of the Atreides house, but not for long. Going back to the beginning of the story, the Atreides family gains a planet called Arrakis, or also called Dune. The centerpiece of the story, the planet was previously owned by the Harkonnen, who are fierce rivals of the Atreides, and the Harkonnen have held control over Arrakis for longer than 80 years, accumulating an immense fortune, making them one of the richest, if not the richest house of all the Landsred, even taking the Emperor into consideration. But as we follow the characters' perspectives, we discover very soon that the Atreides takeover of Arrakis is a secret plan by the Emperor Shaddam IV, whose goal is to get rid of the Atreides family, who are becoming really influential in the Landsred, making other houses look at them as a role model. Leto knows that this is a trap, but he believes that he can turn the tables, defeat the Harkonnen, and hold up against the Emperor. After some pages of Paul hanging around with some characters, around the 90-page mark is finally when the Atreides move into the planet Arrakis. In one chapter they're in Caladan, and in the next they're in Dune. So we get to see how the characters are settling in, and they're obviously not enjoying the new place at all. On all the Dune adaptations we get to see how the journey went. In David Lynch's Dune and in the 2000 miniseries, we saw a Spacing Guild navigator doing his funny stuff or whatever, while in Villeneuve's Dune we just see the space gates, portals between distant places in space. We get to see a lot on how Yui the traitor is dealing with his decision, as we get to see what Jessica thinks about him. She knows that he's hiding something, but she doesn't know what. Shadout Mapes is introduced. She's a Fremen woman who believes that Jessica and Paul are the chosen ones, the Lisan al-Gaib. So there's some walking around and talking around, and finally there's an attempt toward Paul's life with a Hunter Seeker, a small assassination device that is sent into his bedroom with the goal of getting rid of the Duke Leto's son. But since Paul was trained to identify Hunter Seekers, machines that can only sense movements, he manages to stand still and escape the attempt. As Shadout Mapes gets into his room, Paul catches the little device and breaks it. Right after this, we get a chapter on Jessica discovering a green room. The door opens with a specific shape of someone's hand, and since Jessica is a Bene Gesserit, she manages to change the shape of her palm and opens the door. Get inside a room filled with plants and water. So many lives could be maintained with all the water that is wasted in this room, she thinks to herself, as she discovers a secret message written on a leaf about there being a traitor among the Atreides higher-ups. Then Paul finally gets into the room and puts the destroyed Hunter Seeker underwater, burning for sure the little machine, as he tells his mother about something Shadout Mapes told him, about also there being a traitor among the Atreides. We of course know that it's Yui, but that's something none of the characters know about just yet. Later it is discovered that the Harkonnen that tried to assassinate Paul was buried weeks ago under some stones in the basement. He was planted there with the goal of killing Paul, but he failed, and was beaten to death by Tufir's men. Before Leto gathers a meeting with his higher-ups and Paul, he talks to Gurney and tells him to convince the spice miners to remain in Arrakis. Gurney must do whatever necessary to convince as many of them to stay and work for Leto, that is, convince them without violence basically. As the meeting is about to begin, Paul tells his father about there being a traitor among them, and Leto points out how mature Paul has become, but then Tufir tries to renounce from his position, but Leto also orders him to stay as he is, for he is too important for the Atreides. Later, Gurney and some men get inside the room, and they talk about their equipment, resources, plans on how to mine spice melange, and also prepare for the inevitable Harkonnen attack. Although the Harkonnen are the obvious villains of the story, Duke Leto Atreides is also not completely a good guy. He orders his men to falsify documents to get back at the Arrakis citizens who sided with the Harkonnen and steal their possessions, and he is also planning on occupying the Emperor's botanical stations, which can be found all around the planet. Leto's propaganda department is cited as being the best one in all of the Landsred, so the Atreides advertise to the city dwellers in Arrakis that Duke Leto is the good Duke. So is he really the good guy of the story? We can see that Leto is not a good savior, but morally grey, more realistic. As you probably noticed, there is many plans within plans in Dune. The Harkonnens are also conspiring for Leto to believe that Jessica is the one who's going to betray him, that she's working secretly with them, something we know not to be truth, but Leto acts as if he believes that is true, when he, in truth, knows that it's just a Harkonnen trick, and they wrote a lot of truths in that last sentence. Maybe I should rewrite it, but no, I won't. Leto orders his men to get rid of the Harkonnen melange stash. They have been secretly saving up melange as a guarantee of their wealth. They would never admit to the Landsred that this stash is real, so if it were to be destroyed, they just cannot complain about it. Not only the Harkonnen but the Atreides believe that the Emperor and other great houses of the Landsred are also stacking up on melange. Those houses were supposedly allies of the Atreides, but in reality they aren't. Leto, Paul and Gurney finally meet up with planetologist Liet Kynes, the Herald of Change, who is overseeing the Harkonnen move out and the Atreides move in to Arrakis. He believes that the Atreides are just like the Harkonnen, but by the end of the chapter, he ends up liking the Atreides and thinking that they are actually good. Kynes is responsible for the botanical stations of the Emperor. He doesn't like the Atreides' interest in them. He is also an important figure among the Fremen, and also holds up the information on the cycle of spice and how it is created. He knows far more than he tells Atreides, but Paul knows that he is holding up a lot of information. We later get to discover that spice is created due to the sandworm's life cycle, which goes from sand trouts to smaller worms to bigger worms. Melange is only a byproduct. If the sandworms were to go extinct, there would be no more spice melange, so that's the reason why it is dangerous to terraform Arrakis and turn it into a lush forest planet. Kynes knows this, but this is something we only get to know later, as the other books explain us better about many things from Dune. In this chapter we get to see the Atreides rescuing the workers of one of the spice harvesters, which is eaten by a gigantic worm. The ship that was supposed to lift the harvester went missing. This was a huge loss for the Atreides, but Leto managed to save the man of the machine. A huge meeting is set up for the Atreides and most of the important people from the Arrakis nobility. In this meeting there's both people not only from Arrakis, but also some Fremen and guild representatives. Leto makes a tense toast for the gentlemen and ladies at the table. After he drank some of the water from his cup, he dropped the rest of it on the floor, something that everybody present did, except for Kynes, who dropped his water inside another little hidden container from within his clothing. Jessica notices this, just as she notices many other things about the people present. She also discovers that the guild bank representative is a Harkonnen spy. What could he possibly be up to? A discussion between Kynes and said banker proceeds. The banker offends Kynes and says untrue things about the Fremen way of living, which makes Kynes intimidate him, and the baker makes bread! And the banker, scared of Liet, of course, says that he is sorry mate if I ended up offending anyone. Later on, why did I become a Texican? Oh, Texas. Later on, another discussion with Kynes starts once more, but this time with the water magnate of Arrakis. They discuss about the chances of terraforming the planet, and everyone at the table shifts their attention towards the discussion, which is of course very interesting. Jessica notices that Kynes and the contrabandist Tuek have some special sort of deal. as Tuek is ready to protect Kynes in case anything unusual happens. Leto takes part in the conversation and asks about the possibility of terraforming Arrakis, if there is enough water. Kynes acts as if he were unsure about it and answer in such manner, but Paul and Jessica read right through him and discover the truth. A guard urgently comes up to Leto and asks to talk with him. The Duke has to leave the table, so he asks for Paul to sit at his place and for Gurney to sit at Paul's place. The conversation proceeds, but tensions rise once Jessica and the guards all around suspect that the banker is planning something against Paul. Tuek and Kynes interrupt the confrontation with a toast, and everything seems happy and normal once more. Only now Jessica understands that there was, indeed, a plan to kill Paul, but not from the banker, in reality from the steel suit manufacturer's daughter. Gurney and Paul had already seen through the plan. She was to seduce him and kill him, but now she won't be able to do no harm anymore. And the feasting proceeds. I just won't take this seriously anymore, whatever. Mispronounce everything. Jessica asks the banker about where the spice comes from, and as the conversation continues they shift the topic to the southern hemisphere of Arrakis. Kynes comes in and says that all this talk about there being Fremen in the south is a lie, but Paul and Jessica see right through him and know that he's lying. An Atreides servant comes up to Jessica and delivers a little note. It is from Leto and it says how they found the lost carryall, that is the ship which transports the harvesters. A Harkonnen agent killed the other 3 tripulants and then tried to sell the carryall at a contraband center, but Tuek's men took good care of him and warned the Atreides. But there is also an encrypted message in this note. Leto writes that a shipment of las guns was also apprehended, Harkonnen shipment, and Jessica asks herself what the Harkonnen plan to do with such dangerous weapons. If a las gun's laser hits a shield, the nuclear fission that proceeds is strong enough to kill both the one shooting and the one with the shield, so they can become really dangerous weapons for sure. In the chapter that follows, Duncan is caught drunk. He talks about how he killed 1,000 men for his Duke, how he does everything for his Duke, and he asks what could he possibly do in such a place like Arrakis. Jessica, Mapes and Yue come to him. Mapes has a hot spice coffee. Yue was called to treat Duncan, who is quite uncooperative. Jessica tries to make him drink the coffee, but he disobeys her and lets it slip about Hawat's suspicion that she is a Harkonnen agent. Jessica is infuriated and throws the hot coffee at his face, ordering the man to confine him to a room and call Hawat from the city to meet her. And when Jessica and Hawat meet, Jessica discusses how Hawat is not working properly. He's letting the Atreides men get drunk with spice beer. She talks about how the men have no more country. They are in this desolate place that is Arrakis, while their home is back in Caladan. Hawat is also uncooperative. Jessica tells him about how incorrect his suspicions of her are, about how his mentat logic is the one thing getting in the middle of his view. Hawat cannot accept that his logic, the most important thing for a mentat, could be wrong, could be manipulated by the Harkonnen to wrongfully distrust Jessica. Hawat is secretly carrying a little dart gun with poison. He could use it any minute now to get rid of Jessica, the traitor. But what if he were wrong? Hawat decides to leave the room without Jessica permitting him, so she uses the voice and orders him to stay. This is the first time Hawat has ever experienced how strong the Bene Gesserit really are. Hawat thinks about the old Duke, Leto's father. He thinks how himself is the bull and Jessica is the old Duke. I like this analogy because it could go two ways. One, he's the bull that killed the old Duke, just how Hawat could kill Jessica. Two, he's the bull being toyed upon by the Duke, just how Jessica could easily toy with him. So yeah, that's quite interesting. Hawat is freed and he thinks about shooting her, but doesn't follow. As he is dismissed and leaves the room, he thinks about the respect he has deep down for Jessica. As for her, Jessica knows that finally Hawat is going to start working properly, now that he witnessed how Jessica is not the traitor and how powerful the Bene Gesserit really are. The chapter that follows is when everything goes south. We see Leto feeling guilty for not trusting Jessica. It's been 2 days since the dinner, and Hawat has told the Duke about their meeting. Leto decides that it is finally time to talk honestly to her. It was his mistake for not trusting her since the beginning. When Leto leaves his study to the section of the palace where the shield generators are located, he is spooked. It is nighttime, everything is too dark. He then finds the dead body of Tuek, the contrabandist. Next he finds Shadout Mapes. She murmurs some nonsense and suddenly, Leto gets shot by a poisonous dart. He finally discovers that Yui is the traitor. As the generators are off, Yui comes to talk with Leto. He mentions his wife, how she was taken by the Harkonnen, and this is the only way he can know what happened to her and get his vengeance against Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. Yui though knows he won't have a chance to kill the Baron, so instead he switches a single tooth from Duke Leto to be used as a powerful toxin capable of killing the Baron. All Leto has to do is bite down hard and break the tooth apart. Before Leto falls unconscious, Yui says how he will take care so that Jessica and Paul survive this whole ordeal. What follows is Jessica waking up and meeting Baron Vladimir and Peter. The Harkonnen took every measure so that Jessica couldn't use the voice, so her mouth is covered. Baron Vladimir lies to Peter. He says that if Peter forgets his desire for Jessica, he can have Arrakis for himself. While Jessica knows that this is a lie, the murderous Peter doesn't, so he accepts it. Jessica and Paul are led into the desert by Harkonnen soldiers in an ornithopter chosen by Yui. Supposedly an ornithopter that was prepared for the desert. Even though one of the Harkonnen soldiers is deaf, Jessica and Paul manage to overcome them and kill them. Yui prepared this copter with equipment that both mother and son could use to survive the harsh deserts of Arrakis. The preceding chapter tells how Yui managed to hide Leto's ring inside the copter, lurking through shadows, hiding from Harkonnen guards. We also get to see how the Sardaukar are using Harkonnen uniforms so that no witness can distinguish them, but Yui does. As the Bashar meets Yui, he calls him the traitor. The Suck Doctor knows that this is how history will remember him. Poor Dr. Yui, who only wanted to know if his wife was still alive, who only wanted vengeance against Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. I like these first 250 so pages because they are very political. We can see how complicated Dune's universe is, how there's many different interested factions in this conflict, how there's plans within plans within plans. Many plot points are introduced, many ideas. You can wonder what will happen next. Which plan will go through? Who will win? As we stand now, the Atreides pretty much look like the losers in this tale. The Harkonnen are using primitive artillery to blow up the caverns all around Arrakeen. The Atreides men inside would get stuck under the rubble in the darkness and eventually run out of food and water. This is the Harkonnen plan. Vladimir watches Arrakeen burn down from one of his frigates. Arrakeen burns just as the 10 palm trees from the palace's courtyard are being burned by the Harkonnen soldiers. Yui is brought up to his room and finally discovers the truth that his dear Uvana is dead, so Peter stabs him in the back right after this. Yui whispers his last words. "You think you defeated me?" The Baron is worried about these last words, his concern for what they truly mean, until Duke Leto is brought up to him. This is finally the moment he can get rid of the Duke, of this weakling rat. As Leto is far too drugged to think properly, he finally comes up to his senses. They are now in a room, Vladimir at the other end of the table, eating, while Peter is by his side, ready to torture Leto. There's also a Harkonnen general behind, at the door. As Vladimir spits a bunch of bullshittery, I wrote this in the script, Leto feared that he might escape from the range of his poisonous tooth. Leto is ready to take this sacrifice for his men and his family. He knows that Jessica and Paul are safe because he overheard Peter and the Baron having a discussion about them. Leto bites down his tooth and exhales the poison. He believes he's got the Baron before everything went silent. But it turns out only the General and Peter died. The Baron escaped through the back door, behind his seat at the table. The Baron is mad at the situation. As a Sardaukar comes to witness the scene, Vladimir feels humiliated as he is angry for the fact that he will have to appoint Brut Raban back as the steward of Arrakis. Sacrifice his own family's blood so that Foyd Rauta can, in his words, become the savior of Arrakis and its people. Going back to Jessica and Paul, they are hiding inside a steel tent. It turns out that the ornithopter that was following them was actually Duncan Idaho, who now has gone to find other Atreides soldiers that might have survived the Harkonnen attack. As Paul switches between the different radio frequencies, we learn that the Sardaukar have not only dressed themselves as Harkonnen soldiers, but also as Atreides ones. They attack the embassy of the Navigators Guild, putting the blame on the Atreides so that none of their surviving men can find refuge outside the planet. At this point, Paul's powers are rising up. His prescient is coming to the surface due to his exposition to high amounts of spice melange. Paul now knows about Jessica's unborn child, a little sister, Alia of the Knife, she would later become to be called. He also knows about the truth that Jessica is Baron Vladimir Harkonnen's daughter. He also sees the many possible futures that scare him, futures he wishes to avoid. Jessica, although being a Bene Gesserit, now is a slow, dumb-minded child to Paul's perspective. He knows so much, and she seems to know so little. Paul knows that his father is now dead. After telling the truth to his mother, that Leto had never suspected her, Paul can finally cry about the loss of his father. This is the point in the story where the first book, Dune, ends, and the second book, Muad'Dib, begins. The second book starts with Paul and Jessica leaving the steel tent into the desert under cover of the night. It's been long since Duncan should have been back. As they get out into the open, they see explosions in the distance. The Harkonnen ornithopters are firing upon the open desert, killing anything that moves. Paul and Jessica know that they are hunting down any surviving Atreides. On the side of a rock formation, Hawat and around 20 remaining men out of his 300 are negotiating with the Fremen. Hawat intends on getting his vengeance against the Bene Gesserit witch who betrayed the Atreides. He is still unaware that the true traitor is Yui. Yui! Oi, Yui! As Harkonnen units scout around, Hawat and his men get to witness the Fremen fighting against the Harkonnen. Both Hawat and his men are amazed by how strong and skilled the Fremen are. Previously, as they were negotiating, the Fremen told Topher about how they managed to kill 100 Harkonnen and Sardaukar and losing only 2 men, but now as they can see firsthand, they know that the Fremen are extraordinary fighters. That word is difficult. A Harkonnen dropship with around 100 Harkonnen and Sardaukar soldiers comes nearby, but is utterly destroyed by a kamikaze-like Fremen soldier who captured an ornithopter just moments before. Topher is further astonished by how the Fremen fight their death, even sacrificing themselves to protect the tribe from the enemy. Suddenly, a Harkonnen disguised Sardaukar troop jumps from the upper rocks and attacks by surprise the injured Atreides group. Topher gets taken out as the Fremen negotiator is killed by a throwed knife to his throat. Next, we get to see Paul and Jessica meeting with Duncan right after they left their hideout. It turns out Idaho found the Fremen and Kynes, and now they're moving into the botanical labs to negotiate. The botanical lab is manned with Fremen and under Liet's leadership. Kynes has now no issue in hiding his authority over the Fremen people, and Jessica also notices he avoids calling Paul as Duke Atreides. As Paul and Jessica go in an office to talk with Kynes, Duncan waits outside among the Fremen guards. It seems there has been some issue with the station's shields, thus making it necessary for the Fremen to turn off any electrical equipment so that the Harkonnen Sardaukar units cannot detect the botanical lab. As we know, the Atreides have the ability of gaining unconditional loyalty of any of their subordinates. Paul hence more proves this by gaining the unconditional loyalty of Kynes and his Fremen men. But then, suddenly, the office's door is opened wide and our characters get to witness the Fremen and Duncan fighting Sardaukar troops in, once again, Harkonnen suits out on the corridor. Liet leads Jessica and Paul to a secret passage with an ornithopter. This is the last time Liet will ever be able to talk to either Paul or Jessica, as they escaped into a mother storm with the ornithopter. After this had happened, we learned that Baron Vladimir has requested for Hawat, now captured under his custody, to be hired as his new mentat, since the previous one is, well, dead. Not only that, but he ordered Kynes to be killed in an accident. Thus he can get rid of another enemy of the Harkonnen, since the planetologist was caught helping the Atreides. This chapter is also the first time I ever recall Rabban being present in the story, other than just being mentioned. He is often called by Vladimir as an empty-headed brute who thinks only of violence, but something I notice is that he's not as dumb as Vladimir makes him seem. You could say that he's just a big kid with some sort of mental illness, badly influenced by an aggressive Harkonnen lifestyle. Another thing that I've been putting off up until this point is how Vladimir is homosexual. At least I don't remember writing it on the script, but it's a long script, so give me a break. Judging by how he is described and also by some things I read about Frank Herbert's relation with one of his sons, which was also gay, we can confidently say that Frank, well, was a bigot. But that's not the focus of this video, and well, nobody's perfect. Something else that I haven't mentioned is how, well, Vladimir is also a so whenever we get to see him acting in such a way and we get to hear his thoughts, it's disgusting, and well, I hope he suffers a miserable death. So the next chapter is, well, curious. It starts with Paul landing the ornithopter, and with he and Jessica running towards some rocks as the storm dissipates. Once they're at the rocks, they witness a sandworm swallow the ornithopter. Where they had landed, there was no trace left. Something that I find quite interesting is how in-depth with the details chapters like this one are in Dune. Frank went on and literally described every minute detail he could about Paul and Jessica traversing through the desert. I imagine a lot of people probably consider this one of the most uneventful and boring Dune chapters ever. There's nothing really special about it, no deeper message nor meaning, no transcendental passage nor relevant event, but still I really like this chapter. At one point Jessica gets buried by the sand, so Paul has to unearth her. After doing so, he realizes that he left their bag with all the Fremen tools and resources get buried instead. Paul then goes on this little science deal with some batteries of a Fremen compass, creating enough foam to dig a hole 3 meters deep. That's a lot. Very important detail, but at least in the Brazilian edition of this book they use meters to measure the depth. I imagine they wouldn't change the system used in a science fiction book, so probably the original English version of the book also used the metric system. If you're American, please leave in the comments if that's the case, or if in the original version feet are used instead of meters. I mean, screw the imperial system. Is that how it is called, right? The metric system, let's call it that, used by Americans and almost exclusively by Americans. Grow up, baby man, and use the real metric system instead. Why did I write this in the script? So going back to the book, they managed to get those precious resources back. If you were to completely remove this chapter from the book, the only thing that would really be missing is the part where they land the ornithopter and get into the desert. Other than that, nothing that happens here really changes the story. I see this sort of like that whole Tom Bombadil part from the first Lord of the Rings book, where his presence was such of little importance that in the adaptation they completely skipped this part. That's also the probable reason why they never included this whole section in any of the Dune adaptations, at least none that I can recall. Now it's time to see what happened to Gurney Halleck, who has managed to escape and get refuge with the contrabandists alongside 70 other Atreides men. That's a lot of survivors if you ask me. In this chapter we met Staben Tuek, son of the contrabandist who died a few chapters ago, Esmar Tuek. This is such an interesting detail that I totally missed during my first read. Not only that, but I also read the Dune wiki and apparently there's a character in the 5th book that is also named Tuek. He is meant to be a descendant of Esmar and Staben, which is such an amazing detail I only noticed upon reading Dune for the second time. It sort of bothers me because in Dune's 5th book, it's been so long since the events of this book that the Atreides name has changed into Odradi. So how did a noble family like the Atreides had their name changed over time, when a random contrabandist's family name kept on going strong during the same time period and didn't change one bit? I mean, even great writers make mistakes, Or maybe the Bene Gesserit purposefully changed the Atreides name with time, but that's a talk for another video or another book, so let's get back into this one. So, going back to the meat and bones, Gurney decides to stay with the contrabandists just so he can get his vengeance on Raban. As he meets his man back, one of the Atreides who is dying asks Halleck to play him a song. The chapter ends with Halleck playing and the wounded Atreides man dead. Gurney thinks to himself that they are only 73 now. The following chapter goes back to Paul and Jessica. Here they essentially continue from where they last left off. Mother and son cross the desert but end up in an area with drum sand, so naturally the worm is attracted toward them, but they manage to get some rocks. This is that iconic scene where the worm gets out of the sand and shows its big circular mouth with many rows and rows of teeth. Something that I noticed is that apparently the sandworms evolve. I will keep an eye on how they're described as the books go, but in here they're just described as having a big circular mouth. I can recall their description in the 5th book being way different from this, mentioning different throat parts with pits of fire inside the worm and them being extremely hot. Something we don't see at all in here. Also, the book doesn't describe the worm as having those 3 mouth parts that are commonly seen in most of Dune fan arts, but sure, let's move on. One thing that I also don't think I mentioned this far is that spice melange smells and tastes like cinnamon. I don't think I wrote this in the script at all. That's like a big deal. And they completely looked over that little detail. But yeah, so in this scene, Paul and Jessica, when the sandworm opens its mouth, there's a very strong smell of cinnamon comes out of it. So yeah, that's an important detail in this little scene. So going back to the script here, as the sandworm opens its mouth, the cinnamon smell gets everywhere. Oh, I just literally wrote it right here. Well, I guess I'm gonna keep all of that little rant, whatever. And Paul wonders what's the connection between the sandworms and the spice, so yeah, I mentioned it right here. A Fremen somewhere else left a thumper which calls the worm to him, and this lets Paul and Jessica delve deeper into the rock formation. They see many sparse desert plants around the rocks and even more kangaroo mouses here and there. All of this greenery hints at a Fremen presence here, so naturally they show themselves up and get all around their little duo. Stilgar is the leader among them. Quick cut back to Liet Kynes, and it seems the Harkonnen plan was a success. Liet was left out on the open desert with no water and no steel suit, left to die on his own planet. Due to the massive loss of water, he eventually collapses and falls flat to the ground, atop a pre-spice mess, which is almost blowing up due to the accumulation of water, spice and little craters, which are like baby sandworms. Now I could get into extensive detail on how the sandworm life cycle works and how they reproduce and create spice melange, but since that's not really explained in very much detail until the 3rd book, I'll just leave it to this, basically. As for now, you should just know that Liet is basically screwed. As he is on the ground, not able to move or speak, he starts to hallucinate and hear the voice of his father. The old man is teaching him the basics of ecology and how they will make Arrakis green. And it seems that with every thought that goes by Kynes' head, his father hears it and answers him. Some vultures come by, interested in Kynes' presence, but as they're about to bite him, they fly away. Kynes thinks that some of his Fremen men saw the vultures and came to investigate, but he then realized that actually it was the pre-spice mess that was about to blow up. And so the spice blows, killing Kynes in the process. This is the end of the Liet, leader of the Fremen. So with Liet out of the game, we can go back to Paul and Jessica. Stilgar and his men decided that they will take Paul since he is young and can be taught the ways of the desert, while taking Jessica's water since she's an old woman who can't be taught. Of course that backfires. Jessica uses the Weirdling Way and takes over Stilgar, a movement away from breaking his neck, while Paul took down a Fremen and picked his gun, then climbing up some rocks to get a better position to help his mother. Jessica uses her maxed out Bene Gesserit skill points, along with the right dialogue prompts, and convinced Stilgar to let her live so that she could teach the Weirdling Way to the Fremen. She also says that she's a Bene Gesserit, which of course gets Stilgar excited on the prospect that she and Paul might be the prophesized ones. The Missionaria Protectora has done some good work among these Fremen. Paul also gets to meet Chani for the first time, a fairy-faced young woman as the book describes, the girl he has seen in his many visions. Of course, he instantly falls in love with her upon first sight, so onward goes the party, traversing the rocks and sand toward Siege Tabur. Now there's a single basin between Stilgar's troop and the siege, so the group takes camp there. This is the point where I will say Dune gets way more psychedelic and crazy around. We're gonna get a lot more of that going forward. Jessica uses her Bene Gesserit skills on the Fremen and convinces them that she's the prophesized one who will become one of their Sayadinas, sort of a Fremen Reverend Mother. What happens next is that turning point where Jaime takes the Amtal rule and fights Paul. This is how Villeneuve's part 1 of the Dune movie ends, around 400 pages into a book of 600 pages. So, well, that's a lot of adapted material. The Fremen think that Paul was playing with Jamis, since he is defending and avoiding his attacks well, but his own attacks are quite slow, since he is trained to fight with shields, but here on Arrakis there are no shields. So eventually Paul wins the fight and Jessica tells Stilgar and the Fremen how he is used to fight with shields and that he has never killed a man before. Jamis was Paul's first kill. Even though Paul won, he feels guilty for killing Jamis due to both Jessica and Stilgar's reactions. In the next chapter we see another Fremen ritual in which every member of Stilgar's troop takes an item of his possession. Stilgar takes one, then some random Fremen, then Jessica does. Paul realizes the Fremen are expecting him to take something as well. In the end, Paul takes a belly set and ends up crying. The Fremen call this giving water to the dead, something incredibly honorable to the Fremen. This is honorable, Captain Picard. This part is also where Paul is given his tribal name, Usul, only used by those from Siege Tabur, and his general Fremen name, Paul Muad'Dib, after the little kangaroo mouse from Arrakis. Paul can see that this name, Muad'Dib, is how his fanatic legions will call him in those futures where the Atreides banner leaves a trail of death through the universe. So he tries to avoid that by not being called just Muad'Dib, but Paul Muad'Dib, something he hadn't seen in any of his visions so far. Once James's body has been taken care of, Stilgar's troop get past one of the many Fremen water reserves. Those reserves were first created by the Kynes family, now implanted into the Fremen religious conscience as one of the most important factors to turn Arrakis into a green planet. In parallel to all that, Jessica has yet to warn Paul that these Fremen women are not good enough to marry a nobleman like himself. They're only good to serve as concubines, in her own words. She notices that Paul has taken quite an interest in Chani, one of the Fremen girls. She probably didn't realize that she is that same girl Paul has seen in his visions. Jessica does not like the prospect of Paul falling in love with one of those savage Fremen women. In the next chapter we see that it is Feyd-Rauta's 17th birthday, and he will get to fight a bunch of gladiators to commemorate. Many minor and major houses have been invited, have visited Giedi Prime to watch this eventful occasion, including the Fanrings, of whom Count Fanring is the closest friend the Emperor has ever had. Count Fanring and Margot Fanring meet the Baron Vladimir and Feyd as they arrived in Harko, the capital city of the Harkonnen family. This part I always find comical, since the Fanrings have this secret language they use which is comprised of mumblings and moans. So every time they speak to each other they speak normally, but when talking to others, such as with Feyd and Vladimir, they use the secret language in between everything they say. Also, Margot completely rejects Feyd killing a gladiator in her homage, which is also quite funny. Count Fanring and Baron Vladimir get to speak within a cone of silence. The Count leaves it very clear that the Emperor was quite displeased with how the Harkonnen led the Atreides attack, to which the Baron replies, hinting that he will leak the information that he merely transported Sardaukar to deal with the Atreides. which would cause the entire Landsraad to fight against the Corrino with the Harkonnen as their leaders. Baron Vladimir keeps to his wits and thinks about his many plans and how he can manage this position to gain what he wishes for, while the Count sticks to defend the Emperor's interests. Another thing that is quite interesting is how the Emperor himself has no interest in the Fremen, but his Sardaukar do. His soldiers keep on landing on Arrakis to fight the Fremen, even though the Emperor didn't order them to do so. Not only that, but a contrabandist has given Fearing information about vegetation being located in the southern hemisphere of Arrakis, a place where life couldn't possibly exist, although Fearing believes this to be true and there to be some Fremen live in the south. Vladimir dismisses this as being total misinformation by the contrabandist. From his perspective, this is just misleads by a criminal. The gladiator fight is about to begin, so Vladimir and Count Fearing leave and take a ride to where the entertainment will happen. The way this next scene is described, and overall, the way the Harko city is described, although only being a facade, still grandiose and epic. Vladimir and Fearing are transported to the arena to witness the fight, just as many other minor houses are around them. Fearing keeps on cracking jokes about betrayal and committing crimes against the Emperor, of which obviously make the Baron uncomfortable. Once they're there and Lady Fearing is along with them at their seats to watch the fight, the Count makes it very clear that the Emperor has not yet accepted Foyd as the official Baron, that decision being up to them and being the main reason they're visiting Giedi Prime. This of course makes the Baron mad once more. The gladiator fight begins, and from Foyd's perspective we learn that he has poisoned the longer Black Blade, of which is not the custom of being poisoned, instead only the white shorter blade gets to be. So he's basically getting into a fight with two poison blades, an information he's the only one aware of. We also learn that he is working together with Tufir Hawat with a plan to get rid of any government officials that are loyal to the Baron, placing those loyal to Foyd Rauta himself in their places. In this occasion they will get rid of the Harkonnen slave master. The slavery market, along with the spice one, is very lucrative to the Harkonnen house. They sent a slave gladiator that wasn't drugged to fight Foyd, which would in process put the slave master to blame. Both the undrugged slave and Foyd's two blades being poisoned are completely against the customs of the Harkonnen gladiator fight, but Foyd intends on using these to put up a show that nobody would ever forget. As the battle begins, both the crowd and nobles watching realize that the slave is not drugged. Foyd also realizes that the slave is an Atreides soldier, one of the many last Atreides they captured from Arrakis after the slaughter of House Atreides. This little detail was a secret plan by Tufir, who intended to try to kill Foyd. As the fight goes, Foyd comes close to death many times, but manages to use a little trick, a special word to paralyze the slave, to finally cut him down, to die by the poison's hand. Foyd turns the Atreides soldiers upwards so that everyone can witness him suffering with the poisonous cut to his chest, but by using his last strength, the soldier stabbed himself in the heart with his knife, dying immediately as he spat some last words that eventually an Atreides would kill Foyd. The crowd cheers as Foyd Rauta has won. There is also another Harkonnen custom to cut off the head of the defeated gladiator to give it to the public. But since the Atreides fought well, Foyd orders his men to take his body to a proper burial. With the fight over and the Harko population letting the festivities begin, Vladimir leaves to deal with his own businesses and gives one of his guard troops to protect the Fenrings, of whom are talking using their secret language about how Vladimir is a barbarian, a beast of a man, and how Foyd Rauta is easy to control through sex, something Margot will take care of in this very same night, along with getting a baby of him to preserve the bloodline for the Bene Gesserit. The Fenrings contemplate the sacrifices they have to make to do their job, Margot especially. This whole chapter is the longest chapter in Dune, I am pretty sure. It gives off a feeling that the Harko city is pretty grandiose, epic, with giant buildings and banners everywhere, although as I said, this is all a facade to hide the poor population and precarious living conditions of Giedi Prime. Another detail I'd like to share is how I always pictured Giedi Prime as this industrial planet with no greenery nor nature. Maybe it is just because of the Villeneuve adaptation that made me perceive the planet that way, but also how the Harkonnen are overall described. But as we will see on Heretics of Dune, apparently Giedi Prime has vast forests that the Harkonnen used for hunting. We will get to that in more detail later on, but the way I see it, Giedi Prime really is this industrial planet, but due to everything that will happen between the end of this book and the beginning of book 5, the planet got abandoned, and that left space for nature to take over everything, leaving only the last inhabitants at the center of the major cities. Just think of life after people, everything got abandoned and nature took over. Well, going back to what really matters here, Dune, the next chapter goes back to Paul. The Fremen troop have finally reached Siege Tabur. Their movements and sounds are just like those natural ones of the desert, with the exception of Jessica and Paul, who are still clumsy at moving through Arrakis' landscape. Paul notices that the troop gets a bit more relaxed once they reach the siege, but he also cannot find Chani. The news are out, Liet was killed by the Harkonnen, which enraged Paul. Ferroc, one of the Fremen, comes to talk to Paul. This is home and they will get their revenge on the Harkonnen for what they did to the Liet. Ferroc is an interesting character. He will appear on Dune Messiah as well, where his character will get way more development and become much more interesting. But as for now, he's a Fremen fella who talked to Paul and was nice to him. Going back to Paul himself, he guesses how Chani must be feeling right now, just like how he did when Leto died. But he also realizes that Jessica is also missing. Both her and Chani went somewhere, but due to the tension that has gone up among the troop because of what happened to Liet, he dares not ask where his mother and Chani went. Stilgars bring Hera, Jami's wife. Here we get to know that Paul is responsible for her for at least a year, during which time she will serve him and which he can choose if he wants her to become his wife or just a servant. Paul asks her to just be a servant for now, even though, as she loves to point out, she's still young. Hera brings Paul to his Yali, the term the Fremen use for house, and during this little journey deep into the siege, Paul asks many questions about the things that he sees around him, just as we are described about the structure of the siege. Now I will depart into 3 things I would like to point out. The first is, well, as the book has left it very obvious to us up to this point, is that water is the most valuable thing in Arrakis. It even serves as a currency, and furthermore the Fremen are described to use water-filled rings as earrings, jewelry, and even as a coin. Detail I find quite interesting. The other thing is about the sieges. I always imagine them just being like some real-world underground cities. I will show some images of those now and probably whenever we get to talk about the sieges later on. A few nice examples we have are Derinkuyu in Turkey, most of all, but also Niort in France and Orvieto in Italy, for the most, let's say, less important parts of the sieges. Now bear with me, I don't know how to pronounce this word. It's Plzen, Plevzen in the Czech Republic, for the more important parts of the sieges, such as where the leaders in Sayadina live, and finally Petra in Jordan, for maybe how the outside look. But that last one I find a bit of a stretch, since the sieges are meant to be hideouts for the Fremen, so having such a huge intricate structure on the outside should be a major red flag if your intention is to hide in the desert. So I prefer to imagine the outside of the sieges to be more like natural cave entrances. Something that proves that outlook on the external part of the sieges is the fact that Paul didn't even realize he was at the entrance of one until Ferroc literally told him. So yes, the outside of the siege is definitely a naturally looking cave entrance. The last thing before we go back is the water collectors, wind traps. I always perceive them as being vertical windmills, like the ones I will probably be showing in the video. There's a few windmills in Age of Empires 2 which definitely look at exactly what I mean. So look at those windmills, that's how I imagine these wind traps. So imagine with me, a rock formation in the middle of nowhere with cave entrances that look completely normal, sparse vegetation with few vertical windmills here and there. That's how I imagine the outside of a siege looking like. Going back to the book, when Paul gets to his Yali, he orders Hera to get him some food as he starts to relax a bit. The path he's leading is the one that ends up with a jihad, blood of billions in his hands. As he is remorsing around such thoughts, both Jamis' son and Hera's first son, which is not Jamis, get into their house. Paul gets to meet his sort of stepchildren. Well, he'll be responsible for them since, he literally killed their father, who killed, in turn, the father of the older one. Well, let's move on. Now into the last chapter of the second book, we get to witness the rites relating around the Reverend Mother and Jessica. Paul's a bit lost in this chapter, he seems not to know what is about to happen, which makes Jessica question his prescient powers. The Fremen Revenant Mother appears, just as the Sayadina bring the poisonous vial. Jessica is to drink from the so-called water of life, and turn its poison into a liquid the Fremen can consume to have a melange-induced trance. As Jessica drank the water of life, she's flooded with Reverend Mother Ramallah's memories, not only of herself, but also of every other Reverend Mother before her to take part in this ritual. Jessica realizes that the water of life is made when a young Chai Hulud, a sandworm, is drowned, turning the water that drowned it into the water of life. Not only that, but we get many hints that the Fremen originated from a place called Al-Oroba, on the edge of the Nile River. Is this our real world's Nile River, or maybe some other place? Who's to say? The Fremen came from the edges of the Nile River. The original Zen Sunni tribes travel all across the space, through many planets, even through Salusa Secundus before reaching Arrakis. The Empyrean had once in the past enslaved the Fremen people before they escaped once more and finally settled down in Arrakis. Jessica realizes that the Fremen is an ancient culture, maybe as ancient as the Empyrean itself. As this exchange of memories is happening, Reverend Mother Ramallah discovers that Jessica is pregnant. This could bring such dire consequences nobody can predict, but yet it is too late. Ramallah is about to die, so they needed to finish the ritual. Jessica's baby will be bombarded with all of her memories as well. So this chapter has quite a lot of symbolism in it. There's no way I could really describe how deep it goes into details of this whole exchange, but there's something special about it. Maybe Frank wrote it while under the influence of some mushrooms, who knows. To end this part, Paul also has to drink from the water of life, after Jessica has nullified its poison. So he also has some crazy visions about the future. It seems that the Fremen can have these visions of the future themselves. Chani says that she can see that she and Paul will have a baby, but she is scared by those visions. Paul knows that the Fremen are scared of such visions, so they suppress them. Then Paul and Chani share a scene together. Once they are at a closed place, probably Her Yali, finally sharing their love. So the third book is entitled The Prophet, and it starts with Feyd Rautha attempting to kill Vladimir Harkonnen by using a secret poisonous needle on a slave boy's thigh. Vladimir is told by Hawat of his nephew's plan and kill the slave, along with ordering his security master to kill anyone else who is working with Feyd, which he manages to discover with ease. The Baron then talks to Feyd, teasing him about becoming emperor, saying that he will put Tufir Hawat to scheme on getting rid of the Corrinos, but even with all of his knowledge, there are some other things that the Baron is still unaware of, such as Hawat's actions with Feyd for the past 2 years. Yes, it's been 2 years since the end of the previous chapter. Long enough so that a religious leader, Muad'Dib, has appeared among the Fremen people. Vladimir brushes him off as just a way for the Fremen to keep themselves occupied. The chapter ends with Vladimir ordering Feyd Rautha to kill all of his female slaves from the pleasure section. Feyd complies since he knows that if he doesn't do this, the Baron will come up with something even worse to get at him. The next chapter focuses on a conversation between Hawat and Vladimir. They come to compare Arrakis to Salusa Secundus, how the Corrinos prison planet works as a training ground to the Sardaukar due to its extremely harsh conditions, while Arrakis, albeit not being a prison planet, has equally prepared the Fremen to be stronger than ever, stronger than even the Sardaukar themselves. Hawat advises the Baron to let Raban lose control, increase his spice quota, and not send any more reinforcements. This is just for show for the many Corellian spies that might be lying all around Arrakis by now. Another thing they mention is how the Sardaukar killed around 20,000 Fremen, but as estimated by Hawat, they must have lost around 5 times that many men due to transport logs by the Navigating Guild. Arrakis and the Fremen are certainly a powerful tool for the Harkonnen to use. Once Foyd is sent there to act as a savior of the Fremen to free them from the brute Raban. Hawat wonders about this Muad'Dib. It turns out he has been in contact with Gurney as a spy among the contrabandists, feeding Hawat with information about the Fremen. Hawat also still plans a way to get his vengeance on the Harkonnen. After getting up to date with the Harkonnen, we get to see Paul 2 years later. He's totally high with spice, seeing many things that are about to happen in the future, as well as things that happened in the past, things that happened in different timelines, and so on, so on. Once a Fremen tried to challenge him, but Chani swiftly killed him, since Paul was meditating. Humiliating such a Fremen like this by having Paul's wife killing him, she assured that even less Fremen would try to challenge Paul in the future, since they wouldn't be able to beat even his wife. Going back to the present, Paul is going to ride a worm for the first time at 17 years of age, while most Fremen children do this by the first time at the age of 12. Paul recalls all of the advices his Fremen companions gave to him. Stilgar, Chani, they shared tricks and treats on how to control the worm, so that Paul could finally ride south, where his newly born son, Leto II, is at. That's right, everybody! Paul had a baby with Chani, and he's Leto II. Let's see how this little funny fella will do. This part ends with the worm finally on sight, as the thumper thumps by. Paul holds onto his worm hooks. We see over the horizon that the Shai-Hulud that came is the biggest one ever seen by any living man, any living Fremen, ever. This is something Paul had not seen in any of his visions. While this happens, Jessica is meditating at a private room laid out for her in the south. She merely thinks of having coffee, and then a Fremen woman brings a coffee mug up to her. This makes Jessica wonder if the spice also manages to create some sort of hive mind among the Fremen, connecting them all in an unconscious level. A Fremen society working as one as a whole without words, merely a strong psychic connection. I haven't read about Carl Jung yet, although I am very interested in doing so, but from the little I know, he wasn't a conventional psychiatrist. He apparently believed in the paranormal and in something called synchronicity. Reading this part about there being an unconscious connection among the Fremen makes me think of his spiritualistic theories, and how there is indeed a paranormal universe from where our minds are all connected without us being aware of it. But so, as I am interrupting this little section, Jessica is interrupted by someone outside her curtains. It's Hara and Jessica's daughter, Alia. Hara wanted to have a conversation with Jessica about Alia and how the Fremen are scared of her. Even though Alia is merely 2 years of age, she already speaks like an adult and can understand conversations the Fremen grown-ups have. Conversations of topics someone her age shouldn't be able to understand at all. Hera, although being the one complaining about Alia's behavior, also is willing to make the other Fremen understand and respect her, since she took care of Alia since she was born and loves her as if Alia was her own daughter. They are interrupted by Tartar, one of Stilgar's wives, who warns Jessica that Paul is going through his worm riding test, and that a band of Fremen are planning on raiding north to meet Paul and force him to kill Stilgar, thus taking his place in the leadership of the Siege Tabur Fremen. Such event cannot take place, for Stilgar is too valuable and honorable of a man to be wasted in such an archaic custom. Jessica, Hara, and the other Fremen woman know that Paul won't go along with this. And talking about Paul, we go back to him and witness that he indeed managed to tame the Elder Worm. This happens in one page, by the way. His Fremen companions, Stilgar and Chani included, climb up the worm and take seat along with Paul. During this part, Stilgar makes it very clear that Paul managed to ride a worm, but also that he was very clumsy at it and that the Fremen children could have done better. Paul is humbled by Stilgar's words. Paul realizes that Stilgar is aware of the ruckus among the younger Fremen, who wants Paul to take his place, even though Stilgar makes it clear that by the end of the day they will go up north, Paul, maneuvering the worm, decides to go south. He wants to see his mother and his family, a shared feeling among the other Fremen present. Stilgar makes it very clear that they will have to fight to the death if Paul aims to become the leader of Siege Tabur and a member of the Fremen High Council. Paul, on the other hand, plans to avoid exactly that, since it would be just another step into the damned future haunted by Muad'Dib's jihad. Towards the end of the chapter, a small ornithopter is seen on the horizon. Paul and the Fremen let the worm go away and group together in a nearby rock formation. Paul and Stilgar plan on using their reserve of spies to attract those behind the ornithopter and set up a trap to get them. Paul correctly identifies them as being contrabandists due to the fact that there is no visual identification on the ornithopter for it to belong to anyone else. The next chapter introduces Gurney Halleck into the story, and he and the troop of contrabandists came deeper into the desert to collect spice, under suggestion of some of the newer members of the troop. Gurney hasn't had enough time to test them, to know who they really are, so he's a bit suspicious of them. Unfortunately, Gurney falls into a trap set up by the Fremen. All of the contrabandists ornithopters are destroyed, just as half of the men are killed. The bloodshed only ends when Paul reveals himself to Gurney, asking him to order his troop to stand down, an order they obey. What follows is basically how Gurney realizes how much Paul has changed. He has the eyes of Ebed now, he talks and behaves like a Fremen. Paul refers to himself and the Fremen as we, something that sticks to Gurney's mind. From his perspective, Gurney swiftly became the loyal, all-obeying Atreides arms master once more, but he also realizes that Gurney has slightly changed as well. Gurney is astonished when a sandworm comes by and the Fremen start riding it, as if it were a mere pet to them. Their conversation is cut when a sandstorm comes. The Fremen hide in a little cave underneath the rock formation they've been at. Gurney tells Paul of the 10 newest men from his troop that he is still unacquainted with. They could be agents for all they know. Harkonnen agents? Sardaukar agents maybe? What precedes this is a little bit where Paul introduces Gurney to Stilgar, Chani and Korba, a Fedalkin that started being widely mentioned this chapter, and well, let's say that he will become some sort of high priest in Dune Messiah. After Gurney learns that Paul and Chani had a baby called Leto, it ends up that the 10 new contrabandists were in fact Sardaukar. Only 3 of them remain, and after they unsuccessfully try to kill Paul and their commander kills the 3rd one, Korba takes them as prisoners under Paul's orders. Paul plans on letting them escape and warn Emperor Shaddam that the Atreides are still alive. While 8 Sardaukar were killed, only 2 Fremen died. Paul knows that they will make legends on how Muad'Dib killed 20 Sardaukar without even taking his blade out. The chapter ends with Gurney receiving the news that Jessica is still alive. Gurney is unfortunately under the belief that Jessica was the one who betrayed the Atreides. He plans to kill her as soon as she comes close to him. After a little time skip, Jessica is already at the Cave of Birds, which is how the place Paul is at is called. The first scene that proceeds is that of Paul convincing the Fremen to change their customs through a religious enunciation. Jessica thinks to herself that this is something quite dangerous, that if were done wrong, could end up with Paul dead. But since Paul and Stilgar had planned the whole thing up, they pulled off a funny one on the rest of these dummies and convinced them that killing Stilgar and this custom of killing the strongest for leadership is completely foolishness. Well, after that scene we get what might be one of the strongest sections of the whole book upon rereading, which is the part Jessica, alone in a room surrounded by curtains, is threatened by Gurney, who held her neck and a knife against her back, as Paul witnesses. Gurney's intention is to reveal that she's the witch who betrayed Leto and the Atreides, something we know is not true. Although it is like very much the side plot of Gurney and Topher believing Jessica to be the traitor, I will admit that this is definitely one of the strongest passages of the book. It is revealed that although Jessica is a Bene Gesserit, she cried many nights after Leto's death, something she believed that Paul did not know until this moment. Paul also says how it was such a pain to realize that his parents weren't invincible heroes, they were just made out of flesh and bone, just as everyone else. Paul convinces Gurney to stand down. His weapons master obeys and stands down, but he also asks Paul to kill him, something that was of course denied. Both Jessica and Paul forgive Gurney for this, as they call misunderstanding. Jessica even convinces him to take up his belly set and play a song for them. The chapter ends with Paul finally deciding on taking the water of life, the same water that his mother took when she became Reverend Mother of the Fremen. You ask me why? I tell you why. Paul had foreseen none of this. Not only that, but he knows that he is becoming more tolerant to spice melange. It got more difficult for him to have his visions of the future. Just think of how someone under addiction needs to use stronger and stronger stuff. It's exactly like that. Paul would drown a baby sandworm present right there at the Cave of Birds. He would then drink its water. And after doing so, he went in a coma for 3 weeks, enough time for Jessica to bring Chani by ornithopter to the Cave of Birds. What proceeds is Chani giving Paul 1 drop of the water of life, which brings him back to the waking world to fight vile blood beasts. Although for Paul it seemed only a few seconds, 3 weeks had passed since he tried the water of life by himself. Everybody believed he was dead. The tribe leaders didn't just extract his water because Jessica didn't let them. The Fedaykin believed that Paul was in a state of both death and life, a truly divine man. Paul drinks another huge mouthful of the water of life and touches Jessica by her arm. In this transcendental state of consciousness, Paul ordered his mother to show where's the place where the Bene Gesserit dare not look, and then he proceeded towards it. Immediately after this, Jessica opened her eyes and saw Paul just standing there in front of her. She knows that Paul is the Kvisets Hadrach, and she's scared of him. Paul then mentions how everyone has an ancestral power from within, which can either give or take. While man can only get in contact with the power that takes, woman can only get in contact with the power that gives. Paul is now the exception. When he takes, he also gives, and when he gives, he also takes. While saying all of this, Otaim, another Fedaykin, hears all of that, another fanatic that will spread word of how Paul is not like other Fremen, that he is the Lisan al-Gaib. Paul sees everything now. He can see that Arrakis is surrounded by guild ships carrying every single major and minor houses. It seems the transportation prices went completely down, so that even the poorest houses managed to pay for some soldiers to land in Arrakis and sack the planet to gather their own spice. Rabban is now just a weakling with nowhere to go, scared in one of his fortified cities, without any power to stop the other houses from claiming Arrakis for themselves. Even the Emperor Shaddam is ready to invade Arrakis, Paul sees. Another interesting detail is how the guild navigators, those with powers to see the future so that they can sail around the stars, apparently cannot see Paul with their powers. This is something that is better explored in other Dune books, but people with prescience cannot see other that also have this power in their visions. It's like a blind spot in their predictions of the future. To end the chapter, Paul reveals a secret weapon that will guarantee that the Fremen and the Atreides house will win against the guild and the Emperor. That is the Water of Death. To make the Water of Death, Paul says that all they have to do is place some of the Water of Life atop a pre-spice mess. This will cause a chain reaction that will kill the Little Makers and set in motion a catastrophe which will end up in every single sandworm in the planet dying. Yes, I know, this is completely crazy, but it is also only ever mentioned here, toward the end of the first book. As far as I remember, something like this is never brought up ever again in any other Dune book. Sort of sticks out like a sore thumb. Maybe Frank realized that this idea was a little bit too much overkill, so he totally ignored it in the other books. But we will go over them, so that way I will be sure whether the Water of Death is ever brought up again. I don't think it will be. The next chapter is where battles and bloodshed begins. It starts with Paul looking through some binoculars inside the shield wall of Arrakis. The 5 Imperial Sardaukar legions have landed and are on the defensive for now, preparing to go inside as a big storm is coming. Paul takes notes on anything he can. He observes everything. It turns out the Sardaukar have kicked Arrakis citizens out of their homes as well, taking their wives against their will. Paul knows that this will make the populace side with the Fremen against the Emperor. Gurney says that the Sardaukar are doing the enlisting against the Empire for the Fremen. The Fremen's plan is to use nuclear bombs to destroy a portion of the shield wall, which would let the storm inside the depression of Arrakis and where the Imperial flagship has landed. This would in turn completely destroy the electric equipment and any shields within it. Stilgar and Gurney urge Paul to go inside the cave so that they can be protected from the storm. The Fremen slowly realize that this storm is the biggest one Arrakis has ever seen, the most destructive one. So time comes, Paul orders Gurney to fire the bombs and the wall is destroyed. What follows is the Fremen using artillery to fire toward the Imperial ship and the Sardaukar legions, vehicles and equipment, crippling them in the process. The Fremen are firing from the same burned and wrecked caves that the Atreides men were buried during the Harkonnen attack 3 years ago, when Paul lost his father. As the attack continues, the Fremen receive a message that Siege Tabr was attacked, Alia was captured and Leto, Paul's son, was killed in the process. Although the message was received through a lot of static and was quite unclear, Paul knows for a fact that his son is dead, but he cannot feel any emotions for it. He's just an empty husk right now. Now we're going to see the same sequence but from the Emperor's perspective. That's right, Emperor Shaddam IV himself. Something interesting is that the title for emperor or king in Persia and Iran was Shah, and Shaddam starts with Shah. Frank really did study deep to write this book, huh? Another thing I would like to point out is that, in my opinion, as this book is and as well written as it is, this ending portion feels a bit rushed. I haven't mentioned this at all, but the first part of the book was the longest and most complicated one. The second one was shorter and more simpler, just describing mostly how Paul and Jessica assimilated into Fremen culture. But it also felt like something was missing, as if Frank wanted to write more but just ended up not. And then there is the third part, which is the shortest one, and it feels and is a bit rushed. Battles are vaguely mentioned, as we will see in this next chapter, and we would have loved to see battles taking place longer and being better described. It stands out a lot more when you get to read the other Dune books, such as God Emperor or Chapter House. The battles in those books take literal pages, chapters, and in this first one they are just mentioned as background filler. I know Dune is focused on the human mind and its potential, but battles don't happen only in our minds, you know? Going back to Shaddam, he has a talk with Baron Vladimir while Giles Mohiam is by his side. So basically this is a one-sided conversation. Shaddam is very smart and perceptive. Vladimir seems like a dumb jerk on this part, as if the Emperor's presence is enough to strip the Baron from all of his confidence and maliciousness. The Baron knows that he could be killed any moment, although it is very unlikely, since all the other houses are up in space looking down on Arrakis. Shaddam knows that there is vegetation, spice, and most important of all, people living in the southern hemisphere of Arrakis. Vladimir is flabbergasted to hear this. He honestly believed that there was nothing down south. Shaddam and his Sardaukar even managed to capture Alia, who comes into the audience room escorted by Sardaukar guards. 5 transport ships filled with his strongest Imperial troops were sent. Only one managed to escape with Alia, and only because Alia let them. What proceeds is Giles Mohiam losing all composure in the presence of Alia, the abomination. She lets it slip that the Reverend Mothers have other memories, something the Emperor is confused by. While Alia just makes fun of the Emperor and Baron Vladimir, since she knows they won't be able to harm her. So this part right here makes it very clear that even the Emperor himself doesn't really understand the true nature of the Bene Gesserit. We as readers will only really understand them in the final 2 Dune books, but I find this detail right here really interesting. Going back to the scene, the Fremen attack happens, the Imperial flagship shakes all around, the Sardaukar troops run into battle, and Alia takes advantage of the situation and sticks a ganja bar in Vladimir Harkonnen, killing him with the poison after saying that she was sorry for killing her grandfather. So, since I have been writing this script as I am reading and have had many stopping points during this process, it's been a few months since I started this. I don't remember if I mentioned this, but Jessica is the daughter of Vladimir Harkonnen. She didn't know that until she took the Water of Life, so there's that. If I have mentioned it before in the video, now you are sure to not forget it. A A portion of the room the Imperial servants and Shadan are in is blasted off, and everyone proceeds to witness the raging battle outside. Sardaukar and Fremen troops fight down in the fields while the storm is raging around, destroying electric equipment with its electric discharges. Sandworms are directed into the field, their backs filled with many Fremen warriors. The Sardaukar never expected to be under such conditions, completely surprised and fighting a far stronger foe. And all that happens in like 2 pages, so a bit underwhelming, but fine. Do you understand my point now? Well, surprised to know the next chapter was the last one, and it's quite a large one. A lot of things happen here. Paul and his closest Fremen come to the Arrakeen palace, where he lived when the Atreides still ruled Arrakis. Paul contemplates the future, he foresees many things. He sees Alia telling him how she killed Vladimir. She's out there right now killing off injured Sardaukar with a knife. She would be remembered as Alia of the Knife by the Fremen. Paul also sees his own death in many different ways, but cannot see who is the one killing him. Now the Fremen jihad is inevitable. Even if he dies, the fanatic religious Fremen will slaughter billions throughout the universe. Paul has accepted the jihad, but he will do his best to prevent any unnecessary bloodshed. Chani and Jessica are there too. Paul knows that Chani has not taken baby Leto's death lightly. She is in fact having a very hard time, but Paul warms her up and is reassuring that everything will be alright. Leto is irreplaceable, but they will have other children. The Imperial escort has been brought to the palace, and Paul goes out to meet them. Among the escort, there's Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, his daughter Irulan, Gaius Helen Mohiam, 2 guild members, Foyd Rauta Harkonnen, Topher Hawat, and among other unimportant royal servants, Count Fenring. The Fremen soldiers surround them and guard the building, inspecting every single little thing around, so to protect Paul and other important characters. Paul is confused by Count Fenring's presence. He never saw this man in any of his prescient visions of the future. Later on the same chapter, we come to learn that Fenring is a failed Kvisatz Haderach. He cannot see the future, nor has the memories of his ancestors, but he is essentially a blind spot in the visions of any prescient being. Fenring is the man who killed Paul in all of his visions. Topher Hawat comes up to Paul, they share a kind moment together. Topher reveals that the Emperor wanted him to poison Paul, but his loyalty to the Atreides is still strong. Due to the Harkonnen poison, Topher dies in this moment, not before letting it clear that he was wrong about Jessica and that Paul reminds him of the old Duke, Leto's father. The guild swiftly turns to Paul's side. They know that the Fremen will use the Water of Death if they don't comply with Paul and the Fremen's orders. So they use some communication equipment and relay an order so that the guild ships up in space should leave and take the other houses back to their homes. Gaius Mohiam says that the Bene Gesserit forgive Jessica from bringing the Ali abomination to this world, since she was right about Paul being the Kvisatz Haderach. Paul clashes back at her. As they discuss, Gaius is silenced by Paul, who uses the voice against her, and lets it slip about many secrets on the Bene Gesserit breeding program. After this, Paul proposes that the only way they can get out of this pickle they find themselves in is for Paul to marry Irulan, become an emperor in the process. Chani is described as being jealous of Irulan since she is a tall and beautiful princess, but Paul doesn't intend on sharing his love with her, never. The marriage proposal is only politics. Chani will become his concubine and their love will prevail. Jessica assures her, since she was also a concubine, that they would be remembered in history as the rightful wives. Before the Emperor accepts though, Foyd Rauta challenges Paul on single-hand combat, and Paul accepts. Gurney is absolutely against this. He wishes to kill Foyd by his own hands, but Paul knows that Gurney cannot win. He has to do this himself. This battle is fast, but full of little details. Foyd uses the Emperor's blade, which has a simple poison to slow down muscle movement. He lands a cut on Paul's arm, making him aware of the poison. Another instance, Paul lands a successful cut himself. His crisp knife has acid in it to compensate for the poison in Foyd's blade. Foyd also had a hidden poisonous needle. He tries to use it to kill Paul, but he fails and Paul manages to put his knife in Foyd's brain from under his jaw. The fight is over. Shadan orders Fenring to challenge Paul. A challenge Paul would certainly lose, but Fenring stands back and denies obeying the Emperor, who in turn punches him in the face. Fenring and Paul are kin, similar people, tinkered with by the Bene Gesserit breeding program. Finally, the Emperor accepts Paul's demands. All of the Chum stocks will be held under Paul's control, just as Gurney and Paul will gain important seats at the Chum Council. Jessica, Gurney, and any other surviving Atreides will gain Caladan back as their home, and Paul will marry Irulan to consolidate his rule. This is essentially how the book ends, but I also want to talk about the appendices on this book, so let's go. The first one tells us about how Pardo Kynes, Liet Kynes' father, assimilated into the Fremen society and created the universal dream for a green Arrakis. He describes in a summarized style about how he taught the Fremen about ecology and how to insert new plants and animals into Arrakis' ecosystem and how to maintain them. It is also mentioned how he discovered the life cycle of the sandworms, how they go from sand trouts to the spice blow, then young sandworms and then big sandworms. This also mentions how Pardo stumbled by a salt basin, which was enough proof to him that once Arrakis was a green planet, sort of like how the Sahara Desert was green some tens of thousands of years ago. It ends up that Pardo died by being buried alive in a place called Plaster Basin. At that point, Liet was 19 years old, born of Pardo with a Fremen woman, so he took over his father's place as planetologist of Arrakis for the Empire. The next appendix is on Dune's religion, more precisely that of the Fremen and the Orange Catholic Bible. Before the Guild, space travel had no regulation. Anyone with a dubious way to traverse the stars could do so. After the Butlerian Jihad though, leaders of the most important religious groups in the universe came together as the Commission of Ecumenical Translator, or CET, and started working in a way to unify all religions and prevent the machines from ever rising to such level of intelligence in the future. During the same time as this, the Navigators Guild and the Bene Gesserit were also formed. While the Guild had a monopoly over interplanetary travel, the Bene Gesserit were an obscure political group. It took 7 years for the Orange Catholic Bible to be written. It unified aspects of Buddhism, Islam, Christianism, and many other religions under the same pretext that thou should not build a machine in the likeness of a human mind. At first, many protests were launched against the CET, condemning the OCB as the religious book too reliant on logic and an attempt to create new religious symbols in replacement to older ones, such as the Holy Cross, the Buddha, the Crescent and Star, the Star of David, or the Hindu Om. After 10,000 years though, we see that the OCB is the norm religion in the universe. Paul used the OCB sort of a guidebook to essentially control the Fremen. Many of his religious citations have the same meaning as those present in the Bible, but from a different perspective. Paul indeed had the memories of some of the people that were present in the writing process of the OCB. The last two appendices are very short. One of them is the Bene Gesserit official account of them failing to understand that Paul was indeed the Kvisets Hadrach and their perspective of how Paul rose to power, while the other appendix is just an almanac on some royal profiles, such as Shadan and Alia, but not that much is said here. So, Dune's finished. What's my final opinion? Well, I love Dune. It is, as for now, my favorite book series. I just love it so much that I had this idea of reading every single book a second time and writing this analysis of the first one. So obviously Dune is not perfect. There are a few things that don't make sense, such as the Water of Death, which never comes back in the books again, at least as far as I can recall. Another thing that I also said is how the second and third halves of this book feel rushed and unfinished, something that is quite evident to me. But I'm not saying that this makes Dune bad by any means. I still love it, as I stated earlier. Another important aspect of this book is the fact that Dune is not a tale about a hero, but a tale about the dangers of having power in the hands of a single person. This is something that will become more clear in Dune Messiah, but it is a concept that has been present in the story since the very beginning. Religious or political figures with control over every aspect of a group of people are dangerous, and we should keep observant about these types of leaders. We will see if the first book is my favorite one, because well, there are 5 other ones. A little spoiler for you, definitely not either the 2nd, 5th nor 6th books are my favorite ones, so that spot might be left for the 3rd or 4th books, but I will still need to read them again and write my analysis before I can decide that. Talking about that, I intend on making other analysis videos on the rest of the Dune novels. When they come out will really depend on whether this video does well and gets a lot of views and likes. I honestly hope it does. So, what do you think about Dune? I think it is one of the best books ever written, so until the next time when we get to the other books.